Well, welcome everyone to this special event. My name is Yuri Kapgan. I'm class of 2001. I sit on the board of the Berkeley Law Alumni Association and chair the overall REACH program as well as the LA chapter. REACH stands for Regional Engagement Alumni Chapter. And the idea really is to help bring together all of our alumni within different geographic regions, really to help build a community with different events and help people meet each other, as well as to re-engage with the law school. Today's program is a collaborative effort between our Los Angeles, Silicon Valley, and San Francisco REACH programs. Before I introduce our main speaker for today, I just want to highlight a few of our recent alumni events. We had our alumni reunion MCLEs on October 2nd, as well as Dean's Town Hall that happens quarterly. And we also had an inaugural debate that I know some of you attended in this great debate series, this time with Dean Chemerinsky and Professor John Yu debating separation of powers. We've also had a number of different regional chapter events. In Los Angeles, we recently had a trivia night that turned out to be great and a lot of fun. And going forward, we're going to recreate that event in Silicon Valley in November. And we're planning to launch a DC chapter as well early next year. Finally, a good resource for everyone to keep in mind is the alumni homepage on the law school website. There you can find out more about upcoming alumni events, and the MCLEs that I mentioned and other videos are available there as well, including the Dean's updates. If any of you are interested in helping with your local chapter, please email Doreen DeRoque. She's going to put her email in the chat below. For today, in terms of meeting logistics, if you have any questions during the talk, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll have those answered at the end of the talk. And with that, let me introduce Professor Jonathan Simon, who joined the Berkeley Law faculty in 2003 as part of the JD, JSP, and legal studies programs. He teaches in the areas of criminal law, criminal procedure, criminology, legal studies, and the sociology of law. I would surmise that there seem to be few people that have a greater affection for Berkeley than Professor Simon, given that he got his undergraduate degree, his law degree, and his PhD all from Berkeley. His scholarship concerns the role of crime and criminal justice in governing contemporary societies, risk and the law, and the history of the interdisciplinary study of law. His published works include over 70 articles and book chapters and 3 monographs. His books include a book called Poor Discipline, Parole, and the Social Control of the Underclass, another book, Governing Through Crime, How the War on Crime Transformed American Democracy and Created a Culture of Fear. And finally, Mass Incarceration on Trial, a remarkable court decision in the future of prisons in America. And he's also working on a new book that's now titled 4 Myths of the Punitive Society, that hopes to explain why we turn so easily to the criminal law to solve our complex social problems. So with that, let me turn it over to Professor Simon.
Thank you so much, Yuri, and I'm just deeply honored and humbled that so many of you would take time in this extraordinary, epic crisis period to come and study and talk with us about this very important topic. There's a study sheet that is going to be put in the chat that has some questions that I'm going to address and then invites you to think of some questions of your own. And as Yuri said, you can use the Q&A function to just write your questions down as they occur to you. I'll answer as many of them as I can. I'm going to try to limit my own sort of lecture mode so that we can actually have some Q&A on this, because it's such an important topic, and I'm convinced that many of you have ideas and thoughts on this. If you've been my student, you know it can be difficult for me to discipline myself time-wise, so I'm going to keep an eye on the watch here and count on my colleagues here to signal me when the time is right for me to go to Q&A. So, as I said, we're in a time of crisis. I mean, that term can be used too much, I suppose, but right now it doesn't seem possible to use it too much. We have, a crisis of racial injustice and policing. We have a crisis of the pandemic. We have a crisis of global insecurity and climate change, as well as our political polarization. That's frightening, and it's not a time you would necessarily choose to be in. But it's also a time when we have an opportunity sometimes to take stock of our institutions in a way that is hard to do when life is okay. We question basic seemingly permanent features of our society, and maybe this is the time to do that with policing. The picture you see behind me is up there for a couple of reasons. One, Chicago was my hometown. I came to Berkeley, as Yuri said, in '77. It was as far as I could get from Chicago. They were one of the reasons. The Chicago Police Department had terrified me so much as a 9-year-old. I was not out there that night. This is the Democratic National Convention in August of 1968. But I had witnessed some of the violence earlier that day when my mother took me to a peace demonstration. And that began my interest in policing and in state violence more generally. Nationally, we had a serious debate about racism and policing and democracy, actually, because the people you're seeing being beaten up by the police behind me are mostly protesters and journalists and delegates to the Democratic National Convention. So democracy was on the table as well. There were a lot of people then that were saying we need to really change policing, or maybe come up with a better idea, because they saw the effects it was having on Black communities and destabilization that was leading to more generally. Unfortunately, we didn't take that path at that time. Crime rates were very high. Rioting had occurred, often because of police violence. And so, and I'll talk more about this, we entered a 40-year-long war on crime, during which we enormously expanded policing and gave them more powers and urged them to be more aggressive. We're at another crossroads, so I hope we can think hard about whether we want to take a different direction. Now, some people are talking about defunding the police or even abolishing them. So let's ask, why now? Why is this conversation coming up now? Obviously, the horrendous murder of George Floyd and the most recent of seemingly endless series of mostly Black people who have died at the hands of police in situations that are very hard to understand or justify afterwards has been a major issue now for a decade or more. And if you go back to 1968, it was an issue then. But it's also partly that during this 40-year, 50-year period, if you go back to '68, while policing has expanded, most of our urban social services have been in decline, outside of maybe some of the richest cities like San Francisco that have been able to reinvest in them. So from the perception of people in marginalized areas of great economic insecurity and need, policing has gotten more aggressive, while other ways to solve problems, whether it's job training, mental health services, have gone away. Things that were there in the '70s, say when I was a high school student and a college student. This growth in policing and aggressiveness has continued despite the fact that we've had a 20-year crime decline in America. We kept arresting people in the '90s and into the 2000s at very high levels, despite the fact that the actual crime was going down by all measures. And finally, we've seen evidence of a kind of militarization of policing. The cops behind me didn't look like soldiers. Often they do now, and they're carrying weapons that, while not necessarily actually designed to be lethal, are very intimidating and off-putting to people who want to engage in democratic activity. Let me take my next question, because obviously one of the deepest reasons to think about abolishing the police is that people have made very forceful arguments that they're anti-Black, that it's not just racial discrimination by one or particular set of officers or even particular departments, but that policing has an anti-Black sort of axis or focus to it. And I think we could say the whole criminal justice system within this critique is seen as anti-Black. First of all, what does it mean? What does anti-Black mean? A lot of people have responded to the slogan Black Lives Matter by saying, well, all lives matter or should matter, or Black Lives Matter too. But I think the reason that the phrase Black Lives Matter is so important is that in our history in the United States, Blackness has sort of been the low point on a spectrum of inhumanity in which some people's rights are recognized and protected and other people's rights are not, right? And that doesn't mean that if you're not Black, you're necessarily at the top of that spectrum. It's just that it's always been a continuum, right? And I should include Indigenous people too, because while we wiped out most of them, so that they've been a small part of the kind of population subject to heavy policing and other forms of punishment, they're kind of close to that end of the pole, end of the spectrum of negativity that we see with Black people. So to say that policing or criminal justice is anti-Black is not to say that other people get off the hook. To the extent that you're queer, Latinx, to the extent that you're unemployed, youthful, or trans, you may find yourself also kind of heading down that continuum, as I said, of lack of worth, lack of human recognition to your status. One of the ironies is that the police were not invented to be anti-Black. It's true that the slave patrol, one genealogy of the policing in America is the slave patrol in those parts of America where slavery continued to be practiced in the 19th century, which is mostly in the South. The public, white public, was basically part of the equivalent of the night watch. They were essentially drafted to police African Americans in the largest southern cities that almost approximated what we think of today as a police force. But the major route to policing that we have today came from London through Boston, New York, Baltimore, and between 1840 and 1880, just about every big American city adopted the police. And they did it for one reason, and it wasn't crime, and it wasn't Black people who were still overwhelmingly living in rural areas before 1900. It was because of immigrants. It was fear of immigrants. I mean, Boston, at the time they adopted the police from London, was a city of about 200,000 people, absorbing about 10 to 20,000 Irish refugees a year, hunger refugees. And if you think we have a bad problem with people getting polarized about immigration now, there were over 35 riots, major riots in the eastern seaboard cities in those decades, almost exclusively over immigration. So it was really fear of immigrants, and I'll come back to this, and the idea that they were kind of dangerous, and if they weren't working all the time, that they would be up to no good, that the police were invented to deal with. That was their primary task, and they're pretty good at that, actually. We can come back to the ways that they've kind of reinvented that task over time. So how did the police and other criminal justice systems become anti-Black? It's really a story of the early 20th century, and two things happen that are important. You've got mass immigration coming in from Europe to the United States. And then with World War I, you begin to get the Great Migration, African Americans fleeing the horrendous conditions and poverty of the Deep South for the new opportunities of the war economy in northern big cities. And at the same time, and partly in response to this, you get a huge embrace by social elites, including the best educated people in America, and university professors, law professors, et cetera, of eugenics, which is almost unheard of now, but was the most scientific and popular idea in the early 20th century. In a nutshell, problems like crime and mental illness and poverty are a product of people with bad traits that are often grouped in races. And if we can keep out the people with the bad traits, segregate the people we already have here with the bad traits, we'll somehow have a society without any problems in a generation or two. It's hard to underestimate how big the legal changes were associated with this. The immigration cutoff of 1924, explicitly based on eugenics. Prohibition, alcohol was called race poison. Prohibition was designed to, again, prevent the degeneration of the race. And of course, mass sterilization. But the criminal justice system was a big part of this. If crime was mainly a product of people with bad traits, then criminal justice should focus on the people we thought had bad traits. And by the end of the 1920s, even immigrants seemed to be less dangerous than Black people. Black people became the major focus of eugenic thinking about degeneracy and about crime in America. And that's where things stood really at the time of World War II. Eugenics got very unpopular after the Nazis sort of took it too far in the eyes of even its supporters. And so the name eugenics disappeared, and some of the activities like mass sterilization disappeared. But the criminal justice system remained dead fast focused on what they considered the heart of the crime problem, the Black community. And this is also the period where, as Black Americans are moving to big cities like Chicago and Detroit, police forces are actually playing a role in enforcing segregation. forcing Black people to live in narrowly defined neighborhoods within large cities, and then driving vice and crime into those neighborhoods, right? Because everyone knows vice is going to exist in a big city. Police make money off of it in those days because they were a lot more corrupt than they are today. But they decided it had to be in Black communities. This is the origin of sort of drugs and crime as Black problems, is that they were made that way partly by the police. It's also a time when white citizens responded to Black migration with rioting. Chicago, Detroit, major cities suffered major anti-Black rioting, and police not only didn't protect Black people, but often participated. So this is the origin of, when people talk about why don't Black people trust the police, it's almost unimaginable that they would, given that history, right? And people, people know their own history. They often don't know other people's history, and that's a problem. So what about major efforts to redress this problem? There's no doubt that police officers are more diverse and better educated by a long shot than they were in the 1960s. They're much less likely to be racially prejudiced in the sort of classic social psychological sense. But unfortunately, that doesn't change this focus on Blackness as crime. And a lot of the effort in recent years has gone into improving trust. President Obama launched a task force on policing and emphasized ways to build trust. And as I said, I think it's an important discussion, but it's a big task, and it has to start with recognition of this horrific history, which, to their credit, some police leaders have begun to do. What about community policing? I mean, whenever I talk to people about police, they always go, well, what about community policing? Isn't that going to help? Well, first of all, it's a very old idea. They started talking about community policing about 2 days after the Watts riot ended as a way of, quote, winning the hearts and minds of the Black community. The basic idea was to sort of create opportunities for police to interact with people in communities that were experiencing heavy policing and crime outside of a law enforcement context, and that would sort of create a rapport between officers and the community. At its best, at its most visionary, community policing promised the possibility of a kind of paradigm shift away from sort of law and order and towards some kind of problem solving where police would help communities identify and solve problems. The problem is that it's rarely amounted to anything more than a public relations activity. Police just aren't that into it. You can assign police to a community policing unit. That doesn't mean that's what they're going to do. They may go to meetings and engage in discussions with people, but most policing remains far outside of that paradigm. Finally, the DOJ under Obama began a very important series of audits of the most troublesome police departments in America, issued very important reports as well as consent decrees. Is this a solution? Well, it's important to bring out the reality that's happening so we can assess the nature of the problem. But bear in mind that there's 18,000 police forces, roughly speaking, in America, right? Even the DOJ doesn't have the resources to undertake that kind of task. Well, let me quickly turn to the question that inevitably comes up, right? Because if we start talking about defunding or abolishing the police, and even if we accept that they have this kind of anti-Black programming that's not part of their personality, but it's part of their job and part of their mission, the question comes up, what about crime, right? What about violent crime, right? Isn't it going to go back up if we defund the police? And I think the first thing to recognize here is that the police weren't invented to deal with violent crime, right? I mean, rioting, yes, because that endangered property, right? I mean, this is the era, the 1840s, 50s, when for the first time in history, capital is exposing itself in the form of department stores, stores of all kinds, commerce, to what they would have referred to as the dangerous classes, people with no wealth and to buy things and every incentive to steal and to engage in this. And so there was a big effort to mobilize cities to adopt policing as a way to suppress rioting, control immigrants, repress theft. For most of our history, what did police do? They arrested vagrants. Vagrancy was the largest category of arrests up until the 1960s, when the Warren Court, on vagueness grounds, struck down a lot of state vagrancy laws, and it was gradually replaced with the war on drugs, right? So the truth is, police were not invented to deal with violent crime. They're not very well designed as an institution to deal with violent crime. And in many ways, violent crime is a problem so complex that it's unfair to expect, a group of people driving around or waiting to act to be able to stop it in the action. We can talk more about this in the Q&A. Now, there's been a lot of effort since 1968 to improve policing to make it better at fighting crime, right? Because that's what the debate was in 68. We can't get rid of the police now. We have all this crime, but let's make them better. Let's spend billions of dollars to train them and to come up with new techniques. So does it work? Well, this is controversial. There are economists who believe in their ability to isolate causes and effects in complex social processes. Count me as a skeptic. But even their best estimates and most optimistic estimates are that the Clinton administration's 100,000 cops on the street campaign, which was the last major effort to expand police forces on a national scale, contributed, in their best estimate, 5 to 10% of the crime decline that we saw in those years, which was over 50%, right? So not nothing, but a small part of a bigger social change that was going on. Now, count me as a skeptic, because in fact, crime went down all over the country, whether people were doing better policing or not better policing. Our colleague Frank Zimring wrote a great book, The City That Became Safe, about how New York roughly doubled the national crime decline average. He thinks that better policing made a difference there. In any event, the thing that people like in New York is what's called CompStat. It's essentially a big data approach to policing that uses numbers to try to focus police activity and to monitor what police are doing, because in the old days, they often didn't do much. The best estimate is that CompStat, if it's done right, adds somewhere between an additional 5 and 10% reduction in crime. And the sad truth, folks, is that things like CompStat aren't done very well in most parts of the country. I've watched the Oakland police experiment with CompStat, a decade ago. Maybe they've gotten better with it. But the truth is, policing is local, and therefore, just because a program worked somewhere doesn't mean it's going to work in other places. I want to turn to a conclusion here so we can get to some of your questions. It does look like there's already quite a number of questions, but I encourage you to write some more. Now, there are people out there who really believe that policing contributes to crime control. Some rely on history. Steven Pinker, the eminent Harvard, I believe he's a linguist, but he writes on everything like you're allowed to do at Harvard, has argued in his recent book that there was a big decline in homicides in the 19th century during this very period where we were expanding the police. I think the better historical explanation is that growing cultural intolerance of violent behavior. If I could take you to an American city in the 1830s, you'd be shocked at the level of drunkenness and armed violence going on around you. That became essentially increasingly discouraged by industrial society's norms and mores. And adopting police forces was one way to express that. Did the police do something to deter people from fighting? They probably did. But again, there were a lot of forces pushing against this. They're pushing against that behavior. So let me turn now to the question about what would we do without the police, right? So again, first, start with some observations. If you're middle class and you live in a middle class neighborhood of Berkeley, like I do, North Berkeley, or in a suburb, you may not see the police very often. You might pass them on the streets, but they may not be in your neighborhoods very often because policing is heavily focused on communities of color for the reasons I've been saying. So in a way, we already live without heavy policing if we're middle class, right? Because, another interesting factoid I'll throw out here is like, if people believe the police could keep them safe from violent crime, do you really think there'd be 500 million guns in private hands? I mean, the number one reason people buy guns is to protect themselves from what they perceive as likelihood of potential violence. I don't think it's a good idea. I'm not encouraging it. I wouldn't do it myself, but I think it constitutes kind of an acknowledgement that already people aren't relying on the police as the main way to protect them from violent crime. But think about the things that cause people to be killed, which is, and I want to again acknowledge that like violence is a terrible problem. Still, even after a crime decline of some significance. One of the things I like about abolitionists who are speaking out now is that they mostly come from the highest crime communities that are suffering the most from violence. They're often Black queer women who are the most exposed to violence, and they want solutions, right? But they don't think the police have been or can be a solution. So what are some of the ways that people get killed? Well, domestic violence. A Houston police officer was just killed last night trying to intervene in a domestic violence situation. So domestic violence is a huge problem. Police can try to intervene. It's not one of the most dangerous things the police do, actually, according to Zimmering's book on when police get shot, is actually intervening in domestic violence. But can we think of better ways to address domestic violence, to intervene earlier before you get to the point where somebody has got a gun and they're threatening their partner or they're threatening police officers that come? If you're middle class and middle aged like I am, that's how you're most likely to get killed in a domestic violence situation, or sadly, an adult child having a psychiatric crisis that's untreated and in our society right now, unintervenable largely, might kill you. Again, are the police going to stop that? I mean, sometimes people call the police when their loved one is having a psychiatric crisis, and sometimes that person gets killed, the person having the psychiatric crisis. So one of the obviously first things to do would be to create an effective mental health intervention system that wasn't based on the police. It could call on the police if they then needed to deal with an armed threat, but it would not be primarily a police response. But, if it would be nice in Berkeley, I could tell you, if you could call something, let's call it 711, and report somebody who's obviously suffering and experiencing, extreme distress. What about housing insecurity? If you live in the Bay Area, one of the sources of insecurity that you may experience is having to navigate past, home encampments of people who have no housing security. So again, cities have to have a robust public works program that addresses whatever's coming, right? If we have a big earthquake, there's going to be massive homelessness. What's going to happen? Do we have a plan for that? I'm not sure we do. If we had an active public works project that was actually ready to turn, dead zones like the area around the Oakland Coliseum into temporary, housing, we might be able to address some of these questions much more effectively. Environmental deterioration. We're going to face increasing, we're thinking about the 21st century. It won't be crime in the streets that is a big threat to our kids as much as often environmental threats through infrastructural deterioration stressed by the environment. We should be hiring hundreds of thousands of infrastructure workers, hundreds of thousands of urban foresters. You know how many people a year get injured or killed by falling branches in New York City? I looked it up at one point. It was in the hundreds. I mean, it's a serious issue. All I'm doing here is just highlighting what a 21st century suite of public safety agencies might look like, because I don't want vigilantes patrolling my neighborhood or your neighborhood. I want public agencies that can respond to insecurities and problems. So let me see if there's anything else I wanted to, I think I'm kind of at the end here, and I'm going to turn to the Q&A here, but I had some questions for you at the end of my talk, and I'll just read them here, and maybe you'll think about them after our talk. So when and where do you feel safe? What role do police play in your sense of safety? What do you see that alarms you in your immediate community that you'd like to be able to intervene, have the government intervene in? And do you see the police as an adequate solution to that? So those are my questions for you. I am now I've got 8 questions here, and I see if I can work my way through this. So William Robinson says, wasn't the police force at the Democratic National Convention mostly of white protesters? Well, you see many of the people back behind me are white. And that is, it's interesting that was a police violent action that got some of the greatest condemnation. I think it was called a police riot by a national commission. And maybe it was because, privileged people were at the target. A year after this, some of you may be watching and I haven't gotten a chance to see it yet, the Chicago 7 movie. I'm eager to see it, but they were on trial for planning the demonstrations that led to this. A year later, there was the Days of Rage when the Yippies came back and had a kind of smashed windows in the loop kind of thing. Again, very white dominated. Within 6 weeks of that, the police had murdered Fred Hampton, who was the leader of the Black Panther Party and generally one of the leaders of the left in Chicago, in a killing that was so outrageous, they actually had to put the cops on trial in 1971 or whatever. Of course, they weren't convicted, but my point being simply that often white protesters would find themselves on the receiving end of police violence, and that got national attention. But it was usually Black communities that got the real lethal violence that came afterwards. Thank you. Zachariah writes, I was appointed to sit on Hayward's community advisory panel to the chief of police, which is directly responsible for advising on strategy for defunding the police and investment in social services like housing, substance use, treatment, and mental health care. Do you have any advice, resources, or recommendations for advocates and community leaders to be effective in achieving local change? Thank you for that. It's a great question. And a former 1L student who knows I hope you're impressed that I was able to keep it to half an hour. Rarely was able to do that with my assigned readings. It's a great question. And let's start with a couple of things. One of the things I like about the defunding slogan is it does put our attention to resources. This is often about resources. How can we get enough resources to solve our problems? And let's be clear, even if we cashed out the entire police department, that wouldn't be enough resources to really address these chronic problems of insecurity that we have in modern society. So it's got to only be a starting point. And I actually prefer the metaphor of shrinking the police, because there are two things. One, I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, things that the police do a lot of that we don't need them to do, and that gets them into situations where they're more likely to attack Black people. One is traffic stops. Not traffic stops that are really done because someone's speeding down University at 80 miles an hour, but traffic stops that are done as a pretext to search a car for drugs or contraband of any kind, right? So I would just rule that out. Can't do that anymore. Cops, if you see a violent, you see a dangerous car driving, stop them. But you can't just stop people because you think you have reasonable suspicion there might be a crime going on for that. What about sending police to deal with low-level insecurities of largely white people observing Black people in their environment, the so-called Barbecue Betty situation, or even the situation that happened to George Floyd, right? Why were 4 Minneapolis police officers deployed because of a possibly fake $20 bill? It's not even clear that was a crime. So again, I would dramatically shrink what the police do to respond to calls for serious crimes, right? I think, if there's an armed situation, we may need people who know how to use arms to deal with that. And again, I don't want vigilantes in the streets of our society. So we may have a role for a much reduced police force in our society. So shrinking should be done with the goal of saving Black lives and right-sizing the police to deal with the things that they can and maybe should deal with, which is serious crime. But it's going to be a big struggle because we don't have enough resources in the bucket that says police to do this. But until we begin to imagine the agencies that would begin to fill this role, and I hope that we do have some kind of major infrastructure, major funding program by a future federal administration, that one form it could take would be, block grants to cities to create new forms of public security that don't just reproduce the same old. All right. Josephine Gordon, what is the law school going to clean up its own house? When I was a student at Bolt, a white woman's laptop was stolen and she falsely accused me of stealing it, even though I had been in the restroom with her at the time it went missing. Even as police came and pinned me to a wall while searching. I'm sorry, my thing keeps leaping around as more questions come in. While searching every inch of my body for a laptop and searched the bags of all students of color. No single white student said anything. I will never forget the looks of accusation in their eyes. I'm so sorry for that. And it's such a repeated event, unfortunately. And we're having a serious discussion on campus right now about campus police. We have a campus police force, and we have to think about how we want to make sure things like this don't happen. One of the realities that we now have is interdisciplinary research. It shows that when crime is placed into saliency, right? If you tell people like a crime's been committed, there's an anti-Black direction immediately, and it's part of implicit bias, and it's part of these institutional forms that have sort of operated. And I guess for me, it's one of the major reasons to consider steps toward abolition, is that if we can solve problems without framing crime as the major handle, we can maybe disrupt this kind of circuitry that we know is part of our psychology and part of our institutions now in a big way. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble with the ordering of these. Let's see. I guess I should be dismissing them after I answer them or something. Let me read with where I am now. I'll go to people I haven't heard from before. Let's see. Would guaranteed national employment? Michael Ashburn asks, be a remedy for the national crime rate. I mean, ironically, Michael, crime dramatically dropped in the 90s and aughties, even though labor force participation was shrinking for many people. So one of the myths I'm writing about in my new book is the idea that idle poor people are the source of crime. This is the myth that was behind the invention of the police, right? All these dangerous immigrants, if they're not working in the factory, they might be committing crime. So we need the police to surveil them and close down their pubs and things of this nature. This association between idleness and crime is a very old one. The devil makes work for idle hands. I think there's good reasons to have people in employment, dignity being among them, and mental health. But I don't think we have to worry so much about crime in that regard. Louise Dibble, good to hear from you again. I've heard that exposure to lead and lead poisoning and the reduction thereof during the 1980s and 90s was a significant factor in reduced crime rates in this period. Do you have a sense of the relative importance of this factor? There's a lot of economists who do econometric analysis trying to figure out which of many factors could have played a role in that. What looks attractive about the model is that the two big peaks of violent crime in the United States was in the early 1900s, 20s especially, and then in the 60s and 70s. Those are essentially aligned with the times of maximum exposure to lead paint in the early 20th century, lead gasoline emissions. So that's the kind of causal story. It's hard to estimate how much. It may well have played a role, and it's a good example of thinking about crime in different ways, right? So, if we all agree that violence is the goal to be reduced and that a big source of violence is, neurological developments, pathological neurology that can be caused by lead poisoning. If you're married to a death penalty lawyer like I am, you will know all about the details of this, but a lot of serious damage from lead can lead to impulse control, deterioration, etc. Then yes, taking a look at the environmental causes of crime is part of that larger reset, I think, as we go forward. All right. Yes, Nicholas says policing is both anti-Black and anti-people of color, especially those of Latino communities who have suffered similar unjust treatment. And again, the anti-Black metaphor in a sense is describing a continuum. In certain parts of the country, there's no doubt that both Mexican Americans and Asian Americans have at times been demonized as much or more. Our colleague Ian Haney Lopez wrote a great book about LAPD and the Latino population. I also recommend Kelly Little Hernandez's book, City of Inmates, on LA in that regard. William Robinson says, while the police might not be able to prevent violent crime, isn't it important to solve such crime, both as a deterrent and because arguably of repeat offenders? I think that's a very important point. And, one of the things I've observed, and I'd be curious what you think about this, my students, don't like this, and it may reflect a generational thing. But how do we solve most serious crimes when they happen these days? Video. The police go around and collect video from all the 7-Elevens and other things around that place, and they put it together, and they don't even necessarily have facial recognition. They just eventually identify car, license plate, etc. They work it. If you live in an urban or suburban area, half the time, or maybe 80% of the time you walk around, you're on video. Could we use that to essentially guarantee that anybody that's, if somebody is raped, if somebody is murdered, somebody's kidnapped, we're going to be able to identify suspects, relatively quickly? Could we do it in a way that, it wasn't the police necessarily that sat like the spider at the center of the web of that information? Maybe it would be a private, foundation with a broad public mandate that would then share that information with the police and investigators when there was a crime. because I think we do need to solve crime, a violent crime in particular. And as our human rights clinic brilliantly showed last fall, crimes in the Black community in Oakland, especially murders, often aren't solved. And they were arguing that sort of having a child murdered and having the police not be able to solve that is a kind of human rights violation. And since we know that policing isn't effective at solving those crimes in particular, and actually, you know, the police only solve about half of all homicides, and that's the best category of crime solution that they've got. That's not a lot, right? So we're not doing a lot now, right? If you're worried about murderers among us, they're there, right? Because we don't solve half of the crimes. Now, the good news is murder is an aberrational behavior for just about everybody. They'll watch the Golden State Killer documentary or movie if you're interested in thinking about other ways that policing is not effective. You know, having local police departments that stop investigating crimes after they, you know, stop occurring in their neighborhood is, you know, one of many problems. William Lisa says, I think the thrust of your comment suggests that we need to divert funds to address the structural sources of crimes. I agree in the interim, however, it strikes me that police are necessary, and statistically, while Black folks agree that major reform is needed, most respondents to a recent survey suggested the need for same or more police officers in their community. And that's accurate. You know, in very studies that interview people in high crime, many segregated communities of color, hear two things, right? That they dislike the aggressive treatment they receive from the police when they're involuntarily, you know, hailed by the police. And they would like more responsive, you know, treatment by the police to solve the problems that they do have with crime. So it is a really complex situation. I would not zero it out, but I would consider addressing some of these problems with other ways. Again, something like half or more of all calls for service for police in our big cities are for mental health crises. Some of those may need to have an armed assistance, but too often, you know, police end up escalating the situation. Now, people say, well, why don't we train them better? Well, yes, they are being trained better. But again, why don't we come up with the right solution rather than try to turn something that was invented for, you know, harassing vagrants into a machine for, you know, solving people's complex psychiatric problems. Yeah, a number of people say, you know, there's where there's where there's current violence, where there's current concern, we need solutions. Again, I don't think expanding the police force. Remember, only 2 years ago, Libby Schaaf won as mayor of Oakland, promising to expand the police force to address very much the kind of concerns that William's talking about. I guess what I would urge William and others to consider is, could we take those funds and actually, you know, address not just root causes, right? Not just root causes, but also other kinds of intervention, real-time interventions, whether domestic violence interventions, whether psychiatric emergency interventions that could help. Zachary asked about readings. I have both some classic and contemporary police histories in my reference list, as well as some recent abolitionist writings. I urge, there's a lot of good coverage now of abolitionist views. And, you know, what's important about them is that they're often centering problems of violence and the need for solutions and the lack of satisfaction with the current, you know, toolkit that we have for this. Have I run out? Let's see. I'm happy to answer more if I haven't offended or off-put too many of you. Let's see, Paula writes, are there any models of successful policing in the USA today that we ought to be looking at? Well, one of the programs that people are most excited about, and it kind of goes to William's dilemma, right? Violent crime in urban areas, is what's sometimes called Operation Ceasefire. And Operation Ceasefire is sort of a hybrid of policing and community intervention. What it often involves is, first of all, the use of sort of intelligence and community knowledge to identify essentially young people in the community that are most in danger of either being involved as a shooter or being shot. They then have these famous call-ins where they're invited to come to a meeting, usually at a church, where they're essentially faced with a panel of clergy, community leaders, and police officers who sort of give them the biblical, I put the path of life and the path of death before you, choose life. Not death, they're not threatening them with death, but, you know, we're going to come down on you if you don't take up this opportunity to change your ways. There are some studies that show that, that has helped. But here's the problem, right? We have 18,000 police forces in America. Operation Ceasefire is an incredibly personal, intimate almost kind of a situation. It depends a lot on charismatic community leaders, clergy people, even charismatic cops to be involved, right? So you can't just put it in a box and ship it to Cleveland and hope that it'll, solve a lot of our problems there. So, there are things that have worked. But again, if you go back to the fact that police were invented not to solve violent crime, that was a late 60s problem, right? That began to then dominate the agenda for police. They were invented to, protect department stores and nice neighborhoods from rioting, from theft, from drunken behavior. And so to keep expecting, and so not surprisingly, when we tell them we need to reform you, you need to do a new job. You're going to now do community policing, you're going to do crime suppression. They go back to doing what they are essentially good at. And that's why the war on drugs continued for so long, because it's a version of essentially vagrancy management. You're moving people around the city, attacking idleness and disorderliness. So it's a little bit of a conundrum that we now think of the police as the way that we're going to solve violent crime, right? Which is not to say that, parts of them, like think about the detective bureau, right? I mean, detectives were actually invented before the uniformed cops on the street. The very first detective bureau was the Bow Street Runners in London. Again, they were mainly hired to solve financial crime, but you certainly could have essentially a detective bureau. In fact, one of the things I think worth thinking about would be to move it to the state level. I'm relatively impressed with the FBI, I have to say. I wasn't in the 60s or with their behavior in the 60s, but as a crime solving organization that doesn't shoot a lot of people unnecessarily, the FBI seems pretty good. If you, again, look at the example of the Golden State Killer, I mean, a serial killer can go all over the state, and because local police forces only care if it's happening in their neighborhood, it's a very inefficient way to solve a crime. What if we had a California Bureau of Investigation that came in whenever there was a killing, whether it was a cop killing a person or a person killing another person, and tried to solve that? That might be a good solution. Let's see, Mark writes, what do you do about police unions that seem to be one of the greatest problems in controlling or overseeing police? With the problem of district attorneys being the prosecutors of police misconduct who have no interest in prosecuting the police because of the ties between police and the DA. So huge problem. Glad you brought that up, right? So a couple of reflections. One, to me, prosecuting police for shootings is not the main solution. There are cases, I think George Floyd's might be one of them, where the police misconduct is so egregious that it meets the mens rea requirements, not to trigger you, of homicide crimes. But most police shootings, in my view, are the equivalent of an industrial accident. They're part of a machine that has been designed to lean heavily onto Black communities, and that inevitably creates situations where Black lives are going to be in danger. So punishing the police is not my primary solution. So I'm not as concerned about that. But your point about unions is really important. And if our friend and colleague Tracy Mears at Yale, who's one of the country's really leading experts on reforming police and is a big proponent of things like building trust, et cetera. One of the things she says is if you want to reform the police, start talking about abolition. Police unions hear abolition, suddenly reform. It sounds like a good idea, right? If you look at Bay Area police unions, they've tried to get out ahead of the abolition movement by suggesting that they're already for all kinds of reforms that have been promoted. So I actually do think that, remember, abolition it's not only one step, it's not necessarily a specific point, it's a horizon. It's after 40 years of trying to solve every problem with police, it's saying, how many problems can we solve without the police, right? So it's a direction. Sarah writes, if you compare crime in Oakland now versus when my father grew up as a poor child with a single mother, what accounts for such dramatic change? Well, if you're talking about the 80s and 90s, 70s, 80s, and 90s is when violent crime in Oakland hit its peak, and in most American cities, I think the best explanation for that actually lies in urban sociology. That is, if you look at American cities at the end of World War II, they were industrial cities built around manufacturing, distribution, et cetera. By the 80s, that was already ceasing to be true, right? We were becoming the service economy that we are today. And the urban dislocation that was caused by that was enormous. And being the kind of libertarian society we are, we didn't really plan for that. In fact, we did things like drive freeways through the hearts of these damaged cities in ways that fractured them, made neighborhood life and informal social control nearly impossible. So I think Oakland suffered from deindustrialization, the loss of its job base, rapid urban sort of mismanagement of the infrastructure. And then why did it get better? I think it got better largely because some of those wounds heal, right? I mean, the problem wasn't the people. The problem was the social planning or lack of planning we were doing, right? And we kind of stopped messing our cities up in the 1980s. We sort of ran out of money to spend on freeways. You know, I've always thought that the San Francisco earthquake, by making us take down the San Francisco freeways, was one of the greatest boons, you know, to urban life in San Francisco. So there are ways to bring cities back, and it doesn't have to involve more policing. Is there a concern that less police presence in the communities of color will be replaced by an expansion of gangs? Again, yes, if police abolition means, you know, the cops are gone, but we don't do anything else. So I think, you know, gangs, as some of my colleagues who are game theorists actually have studied gangs. And you know what gangs are is a rational solution to a problem of state failure, generally. Whether we're talking about prison gangs or neighborhood gangs. You know, little kids don't wake up in 6th grade and go, I want to be a gangbanger, right? It is a rational response to a structure of risk and opportunity in your environment that the police are not changing. If anything, they reinforce it, right? So is there a role for old school social workers in interventions and necessary follow-up? Back in the 60s, this was an active community resource. Of course, government resources to back this up were much more generous then. In a word, yes, right? And one of the things that social workers ought to be very annoyed at is the constant refrain that all we need to do is train police to do this stuff. Well, social work is a profession, right? And policing may be a profession too, right? Let's not assume that the police can then just become the social workers. Louise adds, I've read analysis of the protests following the Rodney King beating in LA that one of the reasons for the oppressive and violent police response is that the car-oriented built environment resulted in a high-tech police force that was radically disconnected from neighborhoods. The black helicopter became the symbol of oppressive policing. It's an interesting point. I'm just reading a terrific history of LA that I put, LAPD that I put in the reference book that's in the chat. The helicopters came after Watts. And remember, Watts terrified not just the city leadership, the state leadership, the national leadership. They thought they were facing what would be a Viet Cong war in American cities, and then that began this militarization of American cities. I don't doubt that it has added to the sense of oppressiveness. What I doubt is that putting cops on bikes, you know, to ride around and hand out lollipops or something is a big enough change, right? I think we really, you know, I'm not saying that some kind of organized force that's out in the community, force in a loose sense, it could be part of our urban security, suburban security problem. But again, if you live in the suburbs, if you live in North Berkeley, you don't see the police, right? My neighbors have to call the police because they're always annoyed that people are driving down our narrow street when it's supposed to be closed to traffic. I don't like that. I don't want more police in the neighborhood. But the point is, we already don't have them. Talking of abolition, according to Paula, is leading to police retaliation in some communities. They're not inclined to reform without a fight. No self-reflection on why community doesn't support them. I mean, Paula's right. And what does that tell you, right? I mean, if you have a force that goes, well, we might not be willing to protect you if you keep complaining about, you know, the way we do our jobs. I mean, people, you know, one of the problems with the phrase militarization of the police is that it's actually quite different in the military. I've never seen our military turn their back on a president that they didn't like politically the way the NYPD did to Bill de Blasio at the beginning of his administration. So we do need, if we're going to be safer, we need to certainly need to have public security forces that don't view themselves as having some kind of entitlement to decide what public safety is, take it or leave it. Oh, Sarah writes, Oakland in the 30s and pre-war 40s. Well, that was a time when the old vice was at its height, right? And often that was concentrated in communities of color by police activity itself to keep it there. I fear that we are both out of questions, and thank you very much, Zachariah, and thank all of you for coming. I'm really honored that so many of you would take your lunch hour, and I hope if you have other thoughts or questions, you'll email me or follow me on Twitter.
And thank you to Professor Simon for a great discussion, and thank you all for attending. Take care, be well, and stay safe.